Sage Wanderer here, and welcome to a new series that I like to call The People Who Made Sage. Something that I have discovered as I've become an old wise sage is that people really aren't individuals as much as they are a compilation of their own experiences. And their experiences are so flavored by and colored by all the people that they've ever known and interacted with. So in a lot of ways, we are a compilation of every person that's ever influenced us. I know as a musician, you can hear the many influences merging together to create my sound that is uniquely mine and mine alone, but it is in so many ways the musical story of my life. And I feel the same way about the influences in my actual life, that in so many ways these people are simply, my life is a compilation of their influences. And so at the top of the list of people who influenced me, at the top of the list of the people who made Sage the man he is today, I have to lay that pretty much at the feet of the old Marine. I think if you watch this show, this channel at all, you'll quickly realize that the old Marine was a huge influence on me and affected the way I view the world and the way I interact with it in a way that no other human being could have. And you know, you'd say, well, that's your father, yes, but the old Marine was a very strong flavoring to add to me, and in so many ways I'm a chip off the old block. In so many ways I'm just like him. And it's really strange because if you watch this channel, you know that my dad was a brown man and I'm obviously a white boy. And so there was always jokes about the milkman being my real father. My own sisters, who are more brown than I am, would tease me that the old Marine was not in fact my father. And if many of you watch this channel, you might have surmised the old Marine's name was Earl. So yeah, I never did like that song that Earl's Gotta Die. Another reason to hate the Dixie Chicks. I hate that song. I hate when I have to play it. I won't play it anymore. I'm stubborn like that. Not unlike the old Marine, who was very stubborn. So Earl's story is one that is unique to the time period in which he grew up. There'll never be another time period in human history where so much change has happened in one lifetime. And when speaking of my grandmother on my mom's side of the family, who just died recently at 105, when speaking of her, I like to say that she was born in horse and buggy days, and she passed away in the day of the internet and social media. And so in so many ways, the Marine's life spanned a similar distance, although he only lived to be, 80, let's see, almost 83. And he was born in the height of the Depression. And if you watched previous videos about my life, I talked about my grandmother, his mother, the one who walked across the state of Oklahoma with a baby on her hip, the one who was a midwife, the one who was a single mom. And so really his story starts with her story. And their stories are intertwined in a way that the two of them were a combined influence on me. My dad and his mother, my grandmother, who I thought that everybody was Indians. We all thought we were Indians. The DNA test says we're not, but we all thought we were Indians. My dad is definitely brown, but the DNA tests say it's because he's African, which, hey, I've been accused of being being the blackest white man in Texas when it comes to music. Labeled that by African Americans who played music with me, who somehow picked up on something I didn't know till I had a DNA test, that my dad was really, apparently, according to the DNA people, part African and not Indian at all. But their story starts in Indian territory. Their story starts in Oklahoma, where my story is winding down. You see, I just moved here to Oklahoma, and Oklahoma is my ancestral home. It's where my grandmother and my father were born. Both of them born near Rattan, Oklahoma. And so the Depression hit when my grandmother was a teenager. And in those days, times got so tough that children were often given away to anybody who could take care of them. Sometimes they were even rented out as slave labor for their room and board. Like, I'll send my kid to live with you. They can clean your stables, and all you have to do is just feed them and clothe them and give them a place to sleep, because I'm worried for their safety and well-being, and I'm trying to help them. And this happened to children as little as 5 or 6 years old during the Depression. You do what you got to do. A lot of that would be considered almost like white slavery now, but it was a survival means. And so this was done to my grandmother when she was 16. She was 16 or 17. She was basically given to a man who would end up being my birth grandfather, my genetic grandfather. And this man was an Indian man. He was a dark man. And he had a decent job and a house, and a rented house. And he agreed to take my grandmother in, and she would keep house for him, cook, clean, whatever. The understanding being that, you know, if he wanted more than that, he would need to marry her. And so what happens when you put a young girl like that in a man's house and they're all alone and times are tough and she's grateful to be there? Well, rub my back leads to other things, and the next thing you know, my grandmother's knocked up. And so there's a shotgun wedding while she's pregnant. And Earl Sr., which, if you know the story, he's every boy on our family, on that side of the family until I was born, was all named Earl. They're just a long line of Earls. And sometimes they named more than one kid Earl. It's just, and it's because that side of the family descended on our white side, our English side, from royalty, literally from an actual Earl. So it was a title that got used as a first name that got passed on down through the Americas into the current times. But at any rate, so Earl, my dad's Earl, my grandfather Earl, he started getting cold feet. He started wondering, what the heck did I get myself into? I think, I mean, your guess is as good as mine. But one day he packs his bags just after the birth of my dad. He's got a young wife, an 18-year-old wife by them. It took a couple years for them to live together before, you know, the events occurred that led to my father's birth. But my dad was born 1933 in the heart of the Depression to an 18-year-old girl and a probably somewhat African-American man. At least at that point he'd be about an eighth, so he would be Mocha, more than likely. And I don't think I ever saw pictures of Earl, although we did find out what happened to him eventually. But as you're about to find out, he left the Rattan area and he went to Tulsa to look for work. And he was going to find a job and send for her. But he didn't send for her. He didn't call. He didn't send word for her. He didn't pay the rent in advance. And when the rent came due, in those days there weren't any rent protection. And when the rent came due, the landlord forced her out. And she was out on her own with no support, with a baby on her hip. And so she had family in the DeQueen, Arkansas area in a little community known as Wicks, Arkansas. And so she set off on foot from Rattan, Oklahoma, across to the Cherokee Strip and to Wicks, Arkansas. But along the way, she, struggled to try to eat. She caught fish when she could. My dad was born in late summer. So by the time she's kicked out, fall is happening. And her walk happens in the early part of winter. And finally she realizes when the first real cold storm comes through that if she doesn't find a place to winter with this newborn baby, neither one of them are going to make it to Arkansas. So she stumbles across a friendly farmer who has some cows, and he's kind of old, and he needs somebody to feed the cows so he doesn't have to get out and wade through the snow. And he feels sorry for her, for this Indian woman and this little brown baby. And so he takes them in and lets them sleep in the barn. And while they're sleeping in the barn, they're getting paid by getting a place to sleep, and they're getting paid by being allowed to eat not from the farmer's table, but she's being allowed to eat the cow feed. So she's working through the winter for room and board, a place in the barn with the cows in the hay to sleep with her and her baby. No heat, no fire, none of that. I think she said after a while the old man offered to let her come in the house, but she didn't want to because she was afraid that, he wanted more, like Earl. He wanted more, and that she would just be used again. So she roughed it out in the winter in that barn, feeding this man's cows and eating the oats and corn and finding ways to prepare it to sustain herself on the cow feed while she breastfed my dad. Well, this man also had some goats, and there was a goat that was pregnant. The nanny goat died in childbirth, I guess you call it childbirth, in baby goat birth, and so she got a baby goat. It was a little nanny goat, and she raised it up, and she ended up staying clear into the next fall with this person, and she didn't leave until she left the next fall. But what happened is she parlayed that goat and another goat she was able to purchase by doing some work for somebody until she had a pair, and they had a bunch of babies. And so she sold a couple of those goats, babies, back to another farmer to get enough money to finish her trip. But it would take her all the way around till the next fall. But she turned the baby goat that she had raised, that little baby that didn't have a mama, she raised that baby goat over the winter by breastfeeding it. That my grandmother breastfed a baby goat to keep it alive through the winter, parlayed the advance that she made by allowing that farmer let her have the goat. He didn't care if the mama goat was dead, the baby was dead as far as he's concerned. And she was able to raise that baby up, breed it into some more goats, and sell a couple of goats for enough money to go where she was going, right? And to finish her trip. And then the remainder of the goats that she had acquired, she turned loose. And from what I heard from people who lived in that part of southeast Oklahoma, there are still feral wild goats that came from my grandmother's herd that she started and turned loose when she left to go to Arkansas. And but it's I guess that baby goat was born in the fall when she first settled into the place, and she got to raise it through the winter and breed it in the spring, and in the summer made her sales and turned the rest of the remainder of the goats loose in the fall of that next year, and then go on to Wicks. So the joke is the old Marine was so tough because he's half brother to a goat. She literally had a baby goat on one teat and my dad on the other teat. That's the kind of toughness that people don't have today. That kind of toughness and ingenuity to survive under circumstances that are, to say the least, less than ideal. And having gone through this polar vortex and found myself in a life and death situation, and being glad I had some preparation set aside for any kind of emergencies, I'm so glad I have that. But it made me feel vulnerable and realize how close we all are to that kind of survival thing where we just got to, throw our bag over our shoulder and walk towards some kind of opportunity that may or may not even exist, if we can even get there or not, just walking off into the unknown. But that's what my grandmother did with this baby on her hip. She went to Wicks, Arkansas, and there she stayed with an aunt who lived there. And this young woman found herself living there as a single mother when suddenly World War II breaks out. And all of the able-bodied men go off to fight the war. And so she's still trying to raise a little boy. By then, I think my dad is, he's 7 or 8 when this is started. He's 8. And so she's been being courted during the same process by the town drunk nut. It's one. My grandmother was damaged goods in the late 1930s, early 40s. She was a single mother with what people called a B word. I hate to use colorful language, but it was a common term back then. But he was considered a bastard child. In fact, people would call him that little bastard. And they didn't mean it because he was mean or ornery. They meant it because that's what he was, a childless father. I mean, a fatherless child. Excuse me. I got that back around. My grandmother, during the Depression, ended up marrying this World War I vet who was kind of the town drunk and the town nut. He had a good job. He worked at the sawmill. He lived in a rented house with a small acreage in a barn. He had a milk cow. He had a mule. And he had enough area to farm where he could almost sustenance farming living from the place. But he also had a job at the sawmill to pay the rent and the taxes because the land was rented, not owned. And so when all of the available men went off to World War II, my grandmother, went ahead and married this World War I vet who had a steel plate in his head from shrapnel during World War I in the trench warfare in Europe. And he had headaches, terrible headaches, and mental issues and anger issues because of the injury. And he drank heavily because of the injury. And so he was at times a mean, malicious drunk. But it was all that was available to a girl who had kind of been soiled and used and tossed aside with a baby of color on her hip. So she married Noah, was his name. And with Noah, she had 5 children with Noah. My dad's 5 half-brothers and sisters. And because he was oldest by quite a bit, that makes him right at 8 years older than his closest sibling, which is my uncle, the retired Marine Corps pilot, colonel in the Marine Corps, who one of the most decorated Marine Corps pilots in the history of the Corps, and definitely at the cutting edge of all the modern innovations in modern warfare until his retirement a few years back. And his son, my cousin, is a general in the Marine Corps, so there you go. But at any rate, these half-brothers and sisters, my dad took care of them, and it shaped his childhood. And so he grew up during World War II and the Great Depression, at the kind of the time of the grapes of wrath. But he had almost a Huckleberry Finn or Tom Sawyer childhood, because Wicks is kind of in the Crystal Mountains. It's kind of in the woods. If you know that country, you know you can kick over any kind of rock you want, and on the bottom there's liable to be crystals sticking out in every direction. And it's kind of a magical place with a lot of springs, natural springs flowing out of rocks and things like that. And of course, it's snaky and it's swampy in places. And there's some thickets back there that they say Bigfoot live in. And that was kind of even known back then in the 1940s. So, but rich men would come from Tulsa or Little Rock, or even people visiting in DeQueen would want to go out and have a hunting or fishing experience in the country. And because Wicks was kind of on that artery that runs right along through the Cherokee Strip north and south rather, because that's along there, they caught a lot of traffic, people stopping in to get gas or whatever. So the old Marine as a child would hang out there with a group of boys and offer to take them fishing or hunting. We'll put you on the fish, we'll put you on the hunt. This would later on play a major role in my dad's career as a minister, because he would use those same skills to court preachers and to jockey for position by being the hunting and fishing guide for most of Christendom in the United States for a few years. And those encounters would also shape Sage. Those are people that made Sage as well, because I got to do some things that, parallel with Jesus to a degree, not comparing myself to Jesus, but Jesus as a child, he got to debate the big minds and confound the big minds. And as a child, I got the same opportunity. It's you ought to see some highfalutin preacher squirm when a little 5-year-old boy kind of crawls up next to him in the chair and looks at him all cute and says, "Brother so-and-so, who made me?" And they say, "Well, son, God made you." "Oh, who made God?" They get him make them squirm every day. Who made? Well, nobody made God. Well, explain that to me then. God made me. Who made him? And things like that. Things like that. That's just one of many examples of these little games I would play with him as a child. But back to the old Marine's childhood, he was part of these kind of like lost boys that would run loose in the woods. And part of that is that Noah, his stepdad, hated him. He saw him as the only thing that kept their family from being legit. He had 5 children of his own and this little bastard. Excuse my French, but that's what they called him. And so sometimes Noah would drink and get agitated and be in pain, and he would start to focus on this unwanted child. And my dad, the old Marine, was mean to me when I was a child, and he did things to me and beat me. But once I sat through his confession in therapy in his elderly years and heard him recount what I'm about to tell you, suddenly it just seemed natural that actually, even though I was abused, I was lucky I wasn't worse abused. Because when my dad was a little boy in Arkansas, Noah would chase him around all night through the woods with an axe, saying, "Come on out, I'm going to cut your head off. We'll finally be done with you. I'll finally have my family, and you won't be dangling and hanging around. And so we're going to get it over with. Come on out. We're just going to chop your head off tonight. This is going to be done with it." And so the old Marine was beat as a child. He was hunted as a child. He was tied down and nearly beheaded on numerous nights, like the one I described, but only saved by his mother, who intervened and put herself between him and the child and was able to save her own child. And he beat her instead then. And so this went on for many years until the woman who was tough enough to breastfeed a goat, the woman who was tough enough to put a baby on her hip, abandoned by her husband, put a baby on her hip and walk across a state on foot, decided that she was done being the abused wife. She decided that she was done being beaten by this man, and even though she didn't want to leave him because he was a provider and she had no other place. Plus, she knew by then as a nurse, she'd become a nurse and a midwife. She knew that Noah also had tuberculosis and was dying of TB. And likely she had it too from being in the same bed with him. And so that played a part in her decision. But she decided that she could put a stop to it without leaving him. So she waited till he got blind drunk one night and fell asleep in bed. And then she got out her sewing kit and she wrapped him up in the sheet like a burrito while he slept. And she sewed it shut till there wasn't nothing but just his little eye holes poking out, and the rest of him was mummified, wrapped in the sheet, and sewed up in a nice tight lock stitch. And then she got a broomstick out, a broken broomstick about that long, and she poked him and made him wake up, and she woke him up. And of course he was in quite a panic that he was sewn up like a burrito and unable to get up or move or try to get up. And she announced as he awakened that the beating of her and her children were over, and to prove it, she was just going to beat him to death with his broomstick so that he would never beat her again, and he wouldn't get the chance because your days are done. I'm going to beat you to death with this broomstick. And she goes to whopping him with this broomstick, and she beats him black and blue. She starts at his ankles and she beats him to his head, intending not to kill him, but intending to really booger him up, but not so bad that he couldn't go to work. It was a fine line. I've heard her tell the story and talk about the contemplation behind it as a young mother trying to survive an impossible situation. And so she beat him in a calculated way and made him swear and promise that once she let him out that he'd never hurt her or the kids again. And if he did, she'd kill him for sure. She'd poison him. She'd shoot him. She'd do what she had to do. And she'd get away with it because he was a tyrant and a nut and a drunk, and everyone knew it. He never laid a hand on Earl Jr. again, and he never laid a hand on my grandma again. And when he had to get drunk and mean, he went to town and got drunk and mean with strangers. So I was unable to get this new series done. This is part 1 of the people that made Sage, the story of the old Marine. Get the rest of the old Marine's life and where I fit into that, and his eventual internment with the other Marines at the National Cemetery in Dallas. And we'll see you next time on The People That Made Sage.